A routine walk in the woods turned into a discovery they would never forget. Father and son stumbled upon an old school bus that had been converted into a home. But what they found inside changed everything. Watch until the end to learn the secret. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning began with a kind of softness that belonged only to the countryside. Sunlight filtered gently through thin curtains in a modest house on the edge of a small village, carrying with it the promise of warmth that would soon push away the last coolness of night. In the single bedroom, a boy stirred beneath the covers, half asleep, his mind still wrapped in the haze of dreams. But his father had risen earlier, his movements deliberate, each sound muffled so as not to wake the household too soon. On the table by the door sat a pack, not large but carefully filled. 2 bottles of water, a wrapped loaf of bread, apples, a packet of dried meat, and a folded wool blanket. The man had also slipped in a small tin box containing bandages, a salve, and a knife. Because no journey into the woods, however simple, should be taken without some measure of preparation. For weeks he had promised his son this day, and for weeks the duties of work and the small interruptions of daily life had made it easy to postpone. But this morning he felt a quiet determination to follow through. Promises to children were not like promises to other people. They were heavier, more fragile. They shaped memory and trust. He wanted his boy to know that when his father said something, it mattered. So today the walk would happen, and no excuse would get in its way. The boy awoke finally, blinking against the gold of morning light. When his father told him to get dressed, his excitement lit up the room like a spark catching tinder. He threw off his blanket, searching for his favorite shirt, the faded one he considered his lucky shirt, and tugged it on with quick movements. His sneakers, worn at the edges and patched twice already, were pulled eagerly onto his feet. From beneath his pillow he took out a smooth stone he had found some days earlier, a small gray pebble he had decided was his talisman for adventure. He slipped it into his pocket, patting it once for reassurance, before rushing to the table where his father adjusted the straps of the pack. The village they left behind seemed unchanged from any other day. A dog barked lazily in the distance. Women hung laundry across sagging lines. Children ran between fences, their shouts rising into the clear air. Men nodded to one another as they went about their work, each gesture practiced, routine, repeated too many times to hold surprise. For the boy, all of this was dull, the rhythm of life so predictable that it felt lifeless. He longed for something beyond these patterns, for discovery, for proof that the world was wider than the worn cobblestones of the street. For the father, the village was more complicated. Its steadiness was comfort, but also a cage. The houses pressed close together, the same paths wound between the same hedges, the same faces said the same things at the same times. There was little room for wonder. That was why the forest mattered so much. They left the narrow road and stepped onto the dirt path that curved toward the trees. The father adjusted his stride, letting the boy move ahead but never out of reach. His thoughts were steady, his steps purposeful, but beneath his calm lay something else, a faint unease, the knowledge that curiosity in children was both gift and danger. He wanted his son to learn to see the world, but also to understand its weight, its shadows, the importance of caution. The boy, however, was all light and motion. His laughter came quickly, spilling out when he saw a rabbit dart into the brush or when he bent to examine the iridescent shell of a beetle scuttling across the path. Each object became treasure, each sound an invitation to go deeper. At first, the forest received them gently. Sunlight streamed between tall pines, painting the ground in golden patches. The scent of needles and damp soil hung in the air, fresh and sharp. Birds sang above, their voices weaving a chorus that seemed to echo from every branch. The boy paused often, his small hands cupping stones, leaves, or insects. Each discovery shone proudly to his father, who nodded with approval and offered short but thoughtful explanations. The father did not overwhelm him with words. He believed the forest spoke enough if one only listened. Still, his few lessons carried weight, each one intended to root in the boy's memory, like seeds that might one day grow. As they walked, the path began to shift. The earth grew softer underfoot, covered in thick carpets of needles and moss. Roots pushed up through the soil in twisted veins, demanding careful steps. The air cooled, dampness lingering in the shade, carrying the smell of mushrooms and old wood. The boy noticed at first the way the forest seemed to change character. What had been bright and welcoming now felt deeper, older, more serious. He slowed a little, his eyes widening as he looked up at trunks so broad he imagined entire families could not circle them with joined hands. He whispered questions, sometimes to his father, sometimes almost to the forest itself, as if expecting the trees to answer. The father listened, not to the whispers, but to the silence between them. He had walked these woods many times, enough to know that familiarity was always deceptive. A turn of season, a change of light, and the forest became something else entirely. His gaze moved often to the sun, marking direction, and to landmarks. A crooked oak, a patch of ferns, a fallen trunk covered with moss. He wanted to be sure of his way, for though he welcomed the wildness, he respected its power to disorient. Hours slipped by unnoticed. They paused on a fallen log to share bread and apples, the boy's legs swinging as he ate quickly, eager to move again. For him, stillness was harder than walking. He wanted the next discovery, the next surprise. His father chewed slowly, his thoughts moving deeper, weighing the balance between wonder and safety. He glanced at his son, saw in him both innocence and hunger, and felt a tightening in his chest. Childhood was fleeting, and he wanted to give his boy as much of the world as he could before it was gone. The deeper they went, the fainter the trail became. Grass crowded the edges, shrubs pressed close, until the path was no more than a thin suggestion on the ground. The father hesitated briefly, considering whether they should turn back. The boy, though, was unwilling to stop. His eyes shone with excitement, his voice full of insistence, and the man's resolve softened. He gave his wife's absence from the story a quiet echo in his mind. A thought of how different this journey might feel if she were here to worry aloud, to balance his risk with her caution. But today it was only the two of them. And so he smiled faintly at his son and allowed him to lead further on. It was then that the air began to change again. The light dimmed, caught in the thick canopy overhead. The sounds of the village had long since vanished, replaced by the whisper of wind high in the branches, and the occasional cry of a distant bird. The boy felt it as wonder, a thrill that tightened his breath and sent his heart racing. The father felt it as weight, the sense of stepping into a space less touched by people, a space that demanded respect. Still, they pressed forward, the boy's quick steps pulling them deeper, the father's steady pace grounding their progress. The forest seemed endless, each turn revealing more trees, more undergrowth, more silence. The boy's anticipation grew, though he could not have said why. It was as if something waited for them, just beyond sight, something hidden in the folds of the land and the shadows of the trees. He touched the stone in his pocket, feeling its smoothness, and whispered to himself that it would bring them luck. The father watched him, a small smile flickering across his face despite his unease. Children carried faith in small things so easily. It was something he envied. For him, faith had been worn down by time, replaced by caution and memory. Yet he did not wish to extinguish the boy's fire. Better to walk with him into mystery than to deny him the chance to find it. The days stretched long, each step carrying them farther from the ordinary world. The forest grew thicker, the path fainter, until at last the boy stopped suddenly, his body tense, his eyes fixed on something ahead. The father followed his gaze, narrowing his eyes, and felt his breath catch. Through the screen of branches just barely visible was a glimmer of metal dull, weathered but unmistakably out of place in the wilderness. The boy's heart leapt. Here was the adventure he had dreamed of, the secret waiting in the shadows of the forest. He whispered a wordless sound, half excitement, half awe, and took a step forward. The father laid a steady hand on his shoulder, his eyes locked on the strange shape, his mind already shifting to questions. Whatever it was, it did not belong here, and that alone made it dangerous. But he also knew they could not turn back now. The forest had led them to something, and it would not let them go until they had seen it fully. The boy's eyes shone as he looked at his father, urging silently for permission to move closer. The man hesitated, feeling the tension of the moment, the weight of choice. Then slowly he nodded, and together they stepped forward, deeper into the undergrowth, toward the secret that waited in the heart of the forest. The boy moved first, stepping lightly over the tangled grass, his eyes fixed on the strange glimmer beyond the trees. His father followed more slowly, every sense sharpened now, his ears tuned to the hush of the woods, and his gaze sweeping across the shadows as if expecting them to shift. The forest pressed close, branches clawing at their sleeves, thorns catching against their shoes, as if the path they now forged was one not meant to be taken. Yet the object ahead pulled them with an undeniable force, its silent presence both warning and invitation. As they pushed through the last curtain of undergrowth, the shape revealed itself more clearly. At first glance, it seemed like a relic left behind by another age, a vehicle abandoned and half-consumed by the patience of time. But as the boy's eyes widened, he understood it was more than just a bus, though the curved roof, the long rectangular body, and the faded traces of yellow paint betrayed what it had once been. Someone had changed it, had altered its identity with their own hands. Wooden planks had been nailed across sections of the metal, forming crude walls. A narrow porch leaned against the side, its boards weathered but still holding, and a small overhang jutted above the door as though offering shelter from imagined rain. The windows, once large and square, had been framed with makeshift shutters, some still intact, others hanging loose. It looked not merely like a ruin, but like an attempt at transformation. It was a bus, yes, but one that had been turned into something more, something that stood halfway between a machine and a home. The boy felt a thrill run through him, his breath catching in his throat. It was as if he had stumbled into a secret world, a hidden cabin built not of logs but of steel and wood and stubborn determination. His imagination leapt at once into pictures, a family stepping out onto the porch, smoke rising from a chimney, voices carried into the trees. He whispered softly to himself, though his father could not hear, as if afraid to break the spell of the sight before them. The father, however, regarded the structure with a more measured eye. To him it was an enigma. He saw the rust that ate at the edges of the metal, the vines curling upward like green veins reclaiming what had been stolen from the earth. He noticed how the wheels had sunk almost entirely into the soil, leaving only the curved fenders peeking out. The yellow paint, once bright and defiant, now clung to the surface in thin, peeling strips, the color of faded parchment. And yet layered atop the ruin, there was intent. Someone had chosen to live here, had hammered wood against steel, had turned an abandoned shell into a place to stay. That knowledge unsettled him, for the forest was vast and empty. Yet here, deep in its silence, stood evidence of human persistence. They drew closer, their steps crunching softly against the thick litter of leaves. The boy felt his heart beating harder with every pace. To him it was discovery, adventure made real. To his father it was mystery, a question carved into the fabric of the wilderness. The forest around them seemed to notice too. Its usual sounds grew fainter, as though the birds themselves held back from singing near this place. The air carried a weight, a watchfulness, and even the boy sensed it, though his wonder did not fade. When they reached the side of the bus, the boy lifted his hand to touch the metal. It was rough and cold beneath his fingers, flakes of paint breaking away to stain his skin. He traced the lines where steel met wood, feeling the difference in texture, the collision of machine and home. His eyes darted over every detail, the crooked steps that led up to the door, the rusted hinges that clung stubbornly to their sockets, the small rectangle of glass set into the door, clouded with grime but still faintly transparent. He leaned closer, pressing his face to the glass, trying to peer into the gloom beyond. The father stood a pace back, his gaze scanning the structure more widely. He noted the porch, the way its boards sagged slightly but still held. He saw the remnants of what might once have been a table nailed against the wall outside, its surface stained and split by weather. He imagined someone sitting there years ago, perhaps eating a meal, perhaps watching the forest. The thought made him uneasy. To build such a life in solitude meant something had been left behind, or lost, in the world beyond the trees. He felt a tightening in his chest, a whisper of recognition, though he pushed it away before it could take shape. The boy pulled at his sleeve, drawing his attention. He gestured eagerly toward the door, his eyes bright with the plea to go inside. The father hesitated. Instinct told him to turn back, to lead his son away, before curiosity drew them deeper into something that was not theirs. But he knew the boy would not forget. To leave now would mean carrying this unanswered question forever, a mystery that would eat at his imagination. And the man, despite his caution, felt the same pull. He wanted to understand. He wanted to see. They circled the bus slowly, their feet brushing against weeds that had grown tall and wild. At the rear, the structure looked even more consumed. Trees pressed close, their branches thrusting through shattered windows, leaves spilling inside. The backlights were gone, leaving only empty sockets like hollow eyes. Beneath the body of the bus, the undercarriage was rusted almost beyond recognition, a skeleton of iron half buried in the earth. Yet despite all of this, the shape endured. The bus stood, stubborn against decay, its silhouette still clear against the tangled green. The boy whispered that it looked alive, as if it had been waiting for them all these years. His father said nothing, but the thought struck him too. The bus seemed less like a ruin than a sentinel, watching in silence, guarding whatever lay inside. They returned to the door and the boy lingered before it, his hand hovering over the handle. The father stepped closer, laying a hand gently on his shoulder, not to stop him but to remind him of caution. The hinges groaned faintly as the boy pressed, the sound startling a bird from the branches overhead. For a moment, father and son stood together in the stillness, caught between retreat and discovery. The forest seemed to hold its breath around them, waiting for their choice. The father's eyes moved once more over the strange home. He thought of the effort it had taken to transform it, of the human story bound within its rust and wood. His son trembled with anticipation, eager to step inside. And in that moment, the man understood that they were no longer just on a walk in the woods. They had crossed into something larger, a threshold where the ordinary world ended and another began. So he nodded once, a small gesture, and the boy's hand closed firmly on the handle. The hinges screamed in protest, and the door shifted open, revealing the shadows within. The father drew a slow breath, steadying himself, and together they stood on the edge of the unknown, ready to step into the silence of the bus that had once been a vehicle and had become, for someone, a home. The hinges screamed as the boy pressed harder, and the door yielded with a slow, reluctant groan, as though it had been holding its silence for too many years. A draft of stale air poured out, heavy with the sense of rust, damp wood, and something older, more human, the faint residue of lives that had long since departed. Dust spiraled upward in the shafts of dim light that filtered through the broken windows, curling and twisting like smoke. Father and son stood at the threshold, one quivering with excitement, the other steadying himself against the weight of unease. Together they crossed into the shadowed interior. The first sensation was of dimness, a gloom that pressed close yet yielded slowly as their eyes adjusted. Where one might have expected chaos and ruin, there was instead an order that suggested care, a deliberate attempt to make the place more than what it was. Rows of seats, once bolted firmly to the floor, had been torn out long ago. In their place lay the rough outline of a home. Along one side of the bus, a wooden table had been fixed against the metal wall, its surface worn smooth in places, scarred in others by knife marks and scratches that spoke of countless meals and tasks. Opposite it, two narrow bed frames had been built from planks, their edges rough but serviceable. One still bore the remnants of a mattress, its fabric torn, the stuffing long since spilled into decay, while the other was covered only by a few brittle boards that had survived the years. The boy's eyes darted eagerly from one detail to another, drinking it all in. To him it was marvelous, as if they had stepped not into a ruin, but into a secret cabin hidden in the woods, a place where stories had been lived. He brushed his hand across the table, traced the edges of the crude construction, and imagined voices gathered here, laughter rising to fill the narrow space. His father, however, saw it differently. For him, every object whispered of necessity and solitude. Each plank nailed in place was not just craft, but survival. Each shelf stocked with jars and cans spoke of someone who had calculated, rationed, endured. It was not the cabin of a carefree wanderer, but the fortress of one who had retreated from the world. Against the walls, Shelves still clung stubbornly to their fastenings. Some jars remained, their lids rusted tight, their contents long spoiled but still recognizable as food once carefully gathered and preserved. A tin can leaned on its side, its label faded to near nothing, a silent relic of some long-forgotten meal. Dust lay thick on everything, softening the edges of use, but not erasing it. There was a lantern, too, its glass cracked, its handle stiff with rust, yet still poised as if it might be lifted at any moment. These objects were ordinary in themselves, but within this place they carried extraordinary weight. They were proof that someone had not only lived here, but had fought to make life possible within these rusted walls. The boy turned then to the drawings. At first he thought them stains, smudges where time and damp had marred the metal. But when he drew closer, brushing gently at the surface, the colors revealed themselves. Crayon marks, faded but unmistakable, spread across a panel near the front. A crooked sun with long rays stretched wide. A house with a triangular roof and stick figures holding hands. They were childish and imperfect, yet they struck the air like bells, clear and undeniable in their meaning. A child had been here. A child had filled this hollow place with the bright language of imagination. The boy froze. His breath caught in his chest. He reached out, almost reverently, and let his fingers hover near the marks, careful not to smudge them further. His heart pounded with recognition. In those uneven lines he saw himself, his own habit of drawing suns and houses, of sketching people who mattered to him. It was as though the walls had mirrored his life, though painted by another hand long before. The father stepped up beside him, his eyes narrowing, his mouth tightening. He did not need to touch the drawings to feel their power. He understood immediately what they meant. This had been more than a shelter for one. It had been a home for a family, or at least for a man and his child. The silence deepened, heavy now with a sorrow that neither spoke. The boy broke it first, wandering toward the beds where further proof awaited. At the head of one bed, etched into the wall in thin, careful strokes, were lines drawn in intervals. Numbers and dates marked them, climbing steadily upward. They were height marks, the record of a growing child. The boy bent close, tracing the faint pencil ridges with his eyes, and felt his throat tighten. He thought of the wall in his own home, where his father had marked his growth with chalk. Each line a victory, each date a memory. Here the ritual had been the same, but carried out in exile, in a bus hidden among trees. Near the foot of the bed lay a small box, collapsed at one side by damp, but still holding within it fragments of childhood. The boy knelt eagerly, tugging at the flap, and pulled free a toy car, its paint chipped, its wheels stiff with rust. Beside it lay a rag doll with one arm missing, its fabric frayed. A small rubber ball rolled against his hand, hardened by time but still round, still recognizable as something once thrown and caught in play. He held them one by one, trembling with awe, as though he had uncovered treasure. To him they were not dead objects, but echoes of laughter, proof that another child had once filled this space with life. His father stood still, watching him, and though pride stirred in him at his son's wonder, sorrow pressed harder. The objects pierced him more deeply than any ruin could. They spoke not just of survival, but of loss. The presence of toys meant joy once lived here, but their abandonment meant it had ended. He thought of the man who had gathered these things, who had hammered the boards, who had marked the wall with dates. He imagined his hands rough with work, yet gentle enough to guide a child's crayon across the metal, to tuck a blanket across his narrow shoulders. That image haunted him, for he felt its weight in his own heart, in his own role as father. It was then he noticed the floor. In the center of the bus, where boards had been laid over the metal, one section seemed different. The wood was newer, less warped, as though replaced more recently than the rest. He crouched low, his fingers brushing across the seams, feeling the slight give of one edge. He tapped gently with his knuckles, and the hollow sound beneath confirmed his suspicion. There was space there, space meant not for repair, but for concealment. He did not speak of it at once, letting the discovery rest within him, a question waiting for its moment. The boy, meanwhile, had returned to the shelves. He pulled down a book, its cover stiff with age, its pages curling at the edges. The title was faint but still legible, a novel once read by lantern light. He flipped it open, coughing as dust lifted into the air, then smiled despite himself, as though touching it brought him closer to whoever had once held it. On another shelf he found a children's book, its cover bright once, now dulled by years. He opened it carefully, half afraid the pages might crumble, and imagined the words spoken aloud, a voice steady in the shadows, a child listening with wide eyes. He replaced it slowly, his mind alive with pictures of nights in the bus when stories had filled the dark. The father joined him, scanning the books, the jars, the scattered objects, piecing together the life that had been here. He felt admiration, too, beneath the sorrow, admiration for the resilience it had taken to carve out such existence, to insist on normality in a place so far from it. But the admiration was shadowed by a deeper question. Why had it ended? What had driven them to leave? Or worse, what had forced them? The silence offered no answer, only the weight of absence. The boy's eyes shone with determination as he turned to his father, silently urging him to look deeper, to uncover every secret the bus held. The man hesitated, but he knew the truth of it already. They stood not in a ruin, but in a story written into every plank and toy and mark on the wall. It was a story of love and struggle, of a father and child who had once fought to make this shell into a home. He felt the parallel so strongly that it unsettled him, as though the bus had been waiting to mirror his own life back to him. The air grew heavier as they lingered, the silence swelling around them, filled with echoes of voices long gone. The boy still moved with restless energy, but even he began to sense the weight of it. He slowed, his eyes lingering longer on the toys, on the marks, on the drawings, his excitement softening into reverence. His father placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, grounding them both in the moment. Together they stood in the dim light, two figures among the traces of others, bound across time by the fragile thread of memory. And though neither spoke it aloud, they both understood that this was no ordinary discovery. It was a life, preserved in fragments, left behind, yet not erased. It had become theirs now too, for by stepping into the bus, they had stepped into the echoes of another father and another child, whose story, though unfinished, still lingered in every corner. The bus seemed to hold them captive even after they had seen so much. Dust hung heavy in the air, floating lazily in the narrow bands of light that slipped through cracked glass and broken shutters, each particle glowing for an instant before dissolving into shadow. The boy remained close to the wall where the pencil marks had been etched, his fingers brushing over the faint ridges again and again, unwilling to let go of the small miracle of another child's presence. His father lingered near the center, crouched low, his hand resting on the newer boards of the floor, weighing whether to pry further into the secret space beneath. Yet for all that they had uncovered, silence pressed harder than answers, and the space between them filled with the weight of memory that was not theirs. The boy looked up, his face flushed with the excitement of discovery. To him, this bus was not a ruin, but proof of possibility. He saw adventure in its walls, the kind of life he had imagined in daydreams, where a house on wheels might carry him to hidden places far from the ordinary world. He whispered with awe about how he would one day build something like this himself, how he too could carve out a home where no one else dared. His eyes shone with a light that belonged to the young, a belief that wonder could be seized and molded with bare hands. For him, the toys, the drawings, the books were treasures, and the bus itself was a monument to courage, not despair. His father, however, felt the discovery differently. To him, every object was heavy, each mark on the wall a burden carried across time. The childish drawings were not only charming, they were haunting, fragile reminders of joy that had once lived here, but had been extinguished. The toys and books were not just keepsakes, but ghosts of laughter, echoes of nights when a child had listened to stories within these same walls. He saw in the man who had built this place an image of himself, a father bending under the strain of loss, fighting to give his child safety, building something with his hands to preserve love against the indifference of the world. The thought tightened his chest, made him afraid in ways he could not voice. They lingered longer than they meant to. The boy wandered from shelf to bed, from drawing to toy, his excitement never dimming. though it softened into a kind of reverence. The father kept his eyes low, thinking of the letters and photographs still lying beneath the boards, thinking of the choice he had made to return them to their hiding place rather than disturb them further. It was enough to know the story in part. The rest belonged to silence. He had no wish to steal more from the family who had once called this bus home. He understood that some secrets were not meant to be fully revealed, and that reverence sometimes meant restraint. Eventually, he touched his son's shoulder and guided him toward the door. The boy resisted at first, unwilling to leave the wonder behind, but his father's steady hand reminded him that even miracles had their boundaries. Together they stepped out, the hinges crying once more, the forest greeting them with a rush of fresher air. Outside, the world seemed unchanged, yet both of them felt different. The trees loomed as before, the canopy swayed gently, but every sound seemed sharper, every shadow deeper, as though the forest itself had absorbed their discovery and grown heavier with it. The boy turned again and again to look back. Each time he did, the bus seemed less like a ruin and more like a sentinel, standing guard in the clearing, its rust and wood holding vigil over memories too fragile to be carried elsewhere. His father did not look back so often, but the image remained fixed in his mind all the same. The outline of the bus, the marks of a child's growth, the toys in a damp box, all of it pressed into him like scars. He walked on with a steady stride, his hand never leaving his son's shoulder, as if to anchor him against the weight of what they had seen. By the time they retraced their way to the faint path that led out of the deeper woods, the light had shifted. Afternoon shadows stretched longer, the golden hue of the sun fading into a cooler tone. The boy had grown quieter, though his eyes still darted to every movement in the undergrowth, as though the forest might reveal another secret at any moment. His father kept his gaze forward, guiding them with sure steps, marking again the landmarks that would lead them home. He thought often of the man who had once done the same, walking out into the forest to gather supplies, leading his child by the hand, always returning to that bus to preserve their fragile world. The image refused to leave him. When the trees finally thinned and the edge of the village appeared, twilight had begun to gather. Lanterns glowed in windows, dogs barked at familiar passers-by, and the simple rhythm of village life moved forward untouched. But for father and son, the sight of home was altered. The ordinary felt strange, the familiar now colored by the knowledge of what lay hidden just beyond the horizon. They had carried something back with them, something heavier than the jars and toys left behind. That evening, they sat at their own small table, bread and cheese between them, the lamplight flickering softly. The boy leaned forward, his voice hushed but urgent, asking what would happen now, what they should do with the secret they had uncovered. His father did not answer quickly. He studied his son's eager face, the light of youth burning in his eyes, and weighed his response with care. At last he said that some stories were not meant to be solved, only remembered, that their value lay not in their ending, but in what they revealed about love, about endurance, about the lengths to which people would go to hold on to one another. The boy listened, nodding slowly. Though his young mind struggled to grasp the depth of it, he would understand in time. That night, sleep did not come easily. The boy lay awake, moonlight silvering the walls of his room, and imagined the child who had once drawn suns and houses on the walls of the bus. He saw him playing with the toy car, sitting cross-legged while his father read aloud by lantern light, measuring his height with pencil marks on the wall. He promised silently to remember, to carry their story within him so it would not be lost again. In the next room, his father lay restless as well, haunted by the image of another man like himself, a father who had built a home of rust and wood for his son. He thought of loss, of survival, of love, and of the fragile line that separated the living from the forgotten. In the days that followed, life resumed its rhythms. The father went to his work, the boy to his lessons and play, but beneath the surface nothing was the same. The boy carried a spark that made him see meaning in every discarded object, in every mark left behind. The father carried a heaviness that made him slower to anger, quicker to hold his son close, more aware of how fragile each moment was. And though they never spoke of it often, the bus remained between them, silent but present, a shadow and a light bound together. The forest reclaimed the bus as it always had, Each day leaves fell across its roof, vines tightened their grip. The yellow paint flaked a little more. Yet inside, the drawings still clung to metal, the toys still rested in their box. The pencil marks still whispered of growth. Beneath the boards, the rucksack remained, its letters and photographs preserved in silence. The bus kept its vigil, waiting for others who might stumble upon it, offering fragments of its story to those willing to look. For the family who had discovered it, the memory never faded. It became a thread woven into their own lives, shaping the way they saw the world and one another. The boy grew with the knowledge that love could endure even in exile, that stories mattered even when they had no clear endings. The father grew with the knowledge that to protect his son meant not just giving him safety, but giving him the ability to remember, to carry meaning forward. And together they carried the truth that even in forgotten places, life leaves its trace, and even in silence, love speaks. When the boy one evening took a piece of chalk and marked his own height upon the wall of their home, his father stood beside him, steadying his hand. His mother, watching, felt her eyes blur with tears, for in that simple act the story of the bus lived on, not as ruin but as memory, not as tragedy but as testament. And so the forgotten bus in the heart of the forest became more than rust and wood. It became part of them, inseparable, a quiet echo carried forward into every step of their lives. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Take a moment to check out our other videos for more powerful stories waiting to be discovered. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.